big welcome back to the Nick Elston Show, Season 6, Episode 9, and we're flying headlong through 2023. Thank you so much for your engagement in the last episode, another powerful episode. And today is no different at all. I'll be honest, this is the first time I've spoken to this guest at all. However, the vibe really shone through. And that's quite a hard thing to do when you've got 23,000 connections on LinkedIn. But when I connected with this person, I just thought, actually, I really like her vibe. I think there's a lot of great things that she's posting out. I think this would be a great story to bring to the show. So, ladies and gentlemen, give it up. Big round of applause for Lucy Griffiths. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. So I guess let's start right at the beginning. It's always a good place to start, even for a non-details guy like me. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Oh, my goodness. So I'm from Gloucestershire, and what do I do? Oh, my goodness. That is a question and a half. Basically, I have managed to build a business where I don't work too hard. So I'm all about living life, work less, live more. And that is that's my mentality. So what I do is I help people to build courses and create passive income. So that means turning what you know, what you love, what you're passionate about into digital courses, and then scaling those. So it means that you can bring in, increasing amounts of revenue by scaling, but you're not scaling your time. You're letting somebody else, your video, do the scaling for you, do the talking for you. So you can get on with doing what you love, whether that's having more time for your family, whether that's, a passion project you have, whatever it may be. But it's just about having better quality of life, but still running a successful business.
Wow. Love that. That's really cool. I think I definitely want to come back to that, because I sense that there's a real personal reason behind this, that your drive for that kind of balance in work stroke life kind of thing. I mean, that concept itself, work-life balance, is a whole different presentation altogether, a whole different conversation altogether, right? But we'll get to that. This show is all about kind of getting to know, I think, especially with somebody like yourself who is very visible, has that high profile, lots of engagement in your content online. Actually, I guess what I want to try and dig down to is the things that maybe people wouldn't pick up from your LinkedIn profile initially, but take you through to the professional career you had to get to us today. So tell us about kind of baby Lucy. Tell us about kind of growing up, education, family life, where you're from, and how that looked, and bring us through to where you are today.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, I have a bit of a crazy story. So when I was 10 months old, my parents, so I was the youngest of 4, and my parents basically shipped us off in so we drove in a little green Ford across Europe, all 4 kids squeezed in the back. God knows how my parents did it, me as a 10-month-old. And we drove to Berlin, and my dad had a job in Berlin. And so he was kind of connected to the British government. He wasn't in the military, but he was kind of connected. And when we got there, our house wasn't ready. And so we had 2 months. Like, I don't know how my mum did this, but we had 2 months when my mum camped like by the side of an airfield.
Wow.
So it's called RAF Gatau, just on the sort of outskirts of Berlin. And we literally lived in, and my mum just did it. She said, "Oh, I got the kids into school, like the older 2, and so she just would, and a friend of hers was there, and she helped her wash the nappies so she could wash." And my mum just survived with and my mum has always been a very can-do attitude. She just she really survives anything. It's quite comedy, really. And so so I lived most of my life abroad. I went from being in Berlin, we're in Hong Kong, we're in Washington. Wow. We were in Cyprus. And so at times I went to boarding school, which I absolutely loathed and was quite badly beaten up at one point and bullied by this awful person. But it, you know, I had this very global life. So I was, you know, exposed to lots of different things globally. And then I used to fly back into Brize Norton and go to school, and then, you know, see my grandparents, and then, you know, fly off in half terms and holidays. And so I had this really, you know, amazing carefree childhood. I was, you know, spent all summers on the beach, and, you know, so and by being connected to the military, you get this amazing life, because they have so many like water sports and like horse riding and pony camps and like all this stuff. So you get to live this really amazing life without actually having to fight in a war, which is quite cool. And so actually,
if I could jump into that point, because I think I love the synchronicity of the universe. And like I said, that this just happened to happen after our last episode with a guy called Aaron Clark, who was talking about his experiences of military life as a child, and also around boarding school and stuff. And his experience is very different. He actually found boarding school quite a kind of community building kind of thing. Was your experiences of boarding school in the UK, or was it outside of the UK?
So mine was in the UK. And I still have a lot of good friends from that time. And it's amazing how we still support each other and very much there. But there was one girl in particular, it was an all-girls boarding school. And nowadays it would be recognized that I can see, as a parent of an autistic child, I can see she most likely is autistic. And but at the time, it was, she would deliberately go to the sweet shop, and we had like a tuck shop. She'd deliberately go and buy sweets with E102 in, which was monosodium glutamate, which was a trigger for her. And then she would become very violent. And so she was bored. She would basically become violent. And she would then, she used to do things like she would pull me off the top bunk by my feet. And, or she used to try and strangle me. It was just, it was really difficult living with that constant like eggshells of, is she going to flip, and who is she going to attack? And she kind of, it was predominantly me, but a couple of other people as well. And it was, other people who were in the dormitory were my protector, like as in they would literally have to pull her off me. And I remember my parents sort of saying, like, my parents were fully aware, and even they would write to the head of that boarding house. And, she didn't really deal with it in a way that I think they would do now. And yeah, it was a pretty brutal 5 years of kind of, although I had great friendships and I did enjoy lots of elements of school life, it was kind of after school where the threat was. And sort of, she was most menacing on like a weekend where we weren't doing anything. So if there was activities, she was busy, that was fine. But on the down weekends, she was just bored. And it was kind of, it was, and I don't know why maybe I was like smaller than some of the others. I don't know. It was why she picked on me. But it was a really awful experience. And it's only when I sort of, as an adult, I began to look at it and go, actually what she did, especially as an adult with a child, you kind of go, God, that really wasn't acceptable. And I was at boarding school from, a really young age. I went from 7. So it was, it was a a really kind of critical time where you're with this person who's really violent. So
yeah, absolutely. And is the reason why I kind of have asked that, and thank you for sharing so candidly. I do appreciate it, and it's because I know, firstly, this is such a big topic that affects many people in, as I said, the dynamics of the audience that's tuning in right now, first and foremost. The other reason is because when Aaron shared last week that there was, sadly, one of his peer group took his own life in boarding school, and there was this kind of, not so much cover-up element, but a gloss-over element, that it kind of, things just moved on in the hope things get better. Do you think that kind of applied?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of we laugh about it still now, but we shouldn't. But so one of my friends, she was really unwell, and so basically we would go to this kind of place, the nurse, who wasn't really a nurse, but we called her a nurse, and go and get, for any remedies for if we were unwell, and she'd basically hand out, sorry, I'm going to cough.
No, that's fine.
Kind of apt. If you had a cough, she'd hand out a throat gargle. It was like a salt gargle. Mm-hmm. She used to give you that, or Kaline and morphine. And I'd not actually clicked that morphine was morphine, but anyway. So until really recently, I was like, oh my God. Anyway, so so she used to give us a gargle for everything. And so this friend, she literally would get a gargle for and what basically happened was she was really unwell, not wanting to eat, and she slipped into a diabetic coma. And they had not recognized the signs. And literally, she was in hospital for a really long time. She was really unwell. And it was all kind of just, actually nowadays that would have been, there would have been like serious questions asked about what was going on. But oh no, it was all glossed over. And, we look back and we go, what the hell was it's just like.
But for all the challenges, as you said, you had some great experiences kind of growing up. You had certainly the travel element and the beach days, and that sounds fantastic. So what about kind of did you go into higher education? Did you go into professional life or home life? What did that look like?
Yeah, so then, when I went to uni, and I was at university in Newcastle, and I'd never really spent time in the UK. Because I'd always lived abroad, and then when I was born in Gloucestershire, and then I'd just come back and I'd spend my time in the Cotswolds, and it was really pretty and idyllic, and so it was quite shocking to me. It was really shocking to see our student housing. There was real poverty. I'd seen poverty elsewhere in the world, but I'd never seen it in the UK. It's shot by sort of barbed wire and glass spikes on top of the houses. And I was really, it was quite motivated to me, actually. It was really like, wow, I had no idea that kind of concept of the UK existed. And I'd always been, so I had an uncle who was a sports writer, and he wrote for The Guardian, and he also worked for ITV Sport. And so when I was growing up and mum and dad were abroad, I would stay with him for a long weekend. I'd go and stay with him in London, and he was like cool, properly. He was this crazy, he used to drink way too much, but crazy Matt, who was a really quite influential sports journalist. And he was of the era of sports journalism where he and Ian Botham would get drunk in the bar together. It was before the days of kind of PR and the big sporting machine. And so he was friends with sports people. And because he didn't care about the gossip stuff, he was interested in the sport. They loved him because they knew all he wanted to talk about was sport with them. And so I would basically go and hang out with him when he was going to a rugby match or a football match or whatever. And I'd just go and get like whoever was there cups of tea, and I'd, or like fill it with whiskey as well. And, and just basically, and I'd just be there. And so, and I really fell in love with journalism. I was like, oh my God, that's what I want to do. And so there was never any doubt that that's what I wanted to do. And so when I was at uni, I worked at a radio station. So there was this radio station in Sunderland called Sun FM. And I worked there. I did traffic and travel. And I just knew that was what I wanted to do. But being around, like seeing sort of real economic deprivation, and this was like the days where Thatcher basically destroyed the Northeast, and Sunderland was completely destroyed by just closing the coal mines, and it was really things were picking up, but it had been destroyed. And I think the same Uncle Frank was also incredibly left-wing, and he was really like, the rest of my family not, but he was really like, and so he had a massive influence on me as well. And so I was very political, but also very into journalism, but really motivated by kind of people and human rights and stories that were that made a difference. Like I wasn't interested, it was so. So I, worked in London, worked in journalism, and I just found myself getting really disillusioned. And I found myself getting more and more having to cover, just nonsense of like, Atomic Kitten doing something stupid, and it was like, I just didn't care. I did not care. It wasn't my thing. And so I went off traveling and thought maybe I'll be a teacher. And so I went to work in China teaching, soon realized I'm not cut out to be a teacher. I was there during SARS, and there was just this massive cover up at the university where I was teaching, and it was fascinating to see. And it was that mix of really it was quite there was nothing spiritual about it. There was just this, I'd never been around somewhere where there was no spirituality, there was no religion, there was nothing, and it just felt like there was something missing. And also that also then just the way things were just kind of covered up, and the way the systems, and I just got fascinated with China. And so carried on, ended up in Bangkok, worked in Bangkok for a long time, got really involved with refugees in Bangkok, and kind of my passion projects were refugees, Burmese refugees. I worked a lot on the border working with Burmese refugee groups. Right. And also with sex trafficking. They were kind of my, so women who'd been sex trafficked, and a lot were refugees women coming from Laos into Laos into Cambodia, and then also from Burma into Thailand. So they were being trafficked to work in the sex bars or in prostitution. So I got really, they were where I'd, work a lot with various NGO groups and, doing a lot of stories. And eventually I was freelance for a few years. And eventually I started working more in TV, and I'd worked in radio in London, and then I worked for various of the big US networks reporting. And then I got a full-time gig in Bangkok. And so I used to travel around the region, which was incredible. We'd cover, from like the tsunami to protests to whatever, George Bush or Obama, flying in on Air Force One, and we get on the plane with them and go somewhere, cover all these big meetings of all the major leaders. So it was a fascinating mix of everything. And because I, also they used to give me all the showbiz stuff as well. So I'd still get still have, I used to go and have to chase Angelina when she adopted her babies, like all around Cambodia. And so all of that I did as well. But I managed to, I really felt like I, made a difference with stories. And in 2008, I remember, so some of my contacts from my days in the refugee camps, they all, we trained them up to be video journalists, and then they went back into Burma, and they basically formed this network of journalists across Burma with just they were small video cameras, but now of course it would just be a mobile phone, and they filmed a protest, and it was literally just one woman walking down the street, but it was an influential nun walking down the street. It was called a walking protest. And I remember getting this footage. It was just literally like a woman in pink robes, a nun in pink robes walking down the street. And I sent it to my office in London, and they were like, why do we care about this? It's not important. It's just one woman. It's not a protest. I can hear the resounding voice of my colleague Tanya down the phone to me. And I was like, look, this matters. This is important. It's a big deal. Anyway, we went from one. Sorry, we had one protester the first day. And I think it was like August 19th, 2008. And then there were 8 the next day. And then there were 15 the next day. And it just gradually built. And by September 19th, there were 200,000 people on the streets. And you called
it, didn't you? You called it.
And it was one of those moments where you just felt like there was real change happening. Sadly, it didn't happen in the way that we wanted it to, but there was there were these moments that you just felt like you were really part of history, and you could really create lasting change for people. And that was one of the things that I really loved about journalism. Like when I say proper journalism, I mean things that make a difference. Not I just find I get so frustrated with kind of just stupid nitpicking on like ridiculous political things that don't matter. When actually there are so many important things that really do matter in the world that they could make a massive difference with. And so then, but around that same time, I'd been asked to move to Beijing. So it was actually a year before I'd been asked to move to Beijing. And I didn't want to go. I was like, oh God, I don't know if I can do this. And so I had some loo days, because you basically work loads and work all weekends. Okay. And then if you're on a big story, let's say, it's an earthquake or something, you go for 3 weeks and you just sleep in the car and you're just working nonstop. So when you come back, you've built up 6 days, and then there's, lots of public holidays in Thailand. And, so I used to have 3 weeks off, and I'd go to the beach and, have my chill time. And so I was in India. And I was kind of mix of, I was working and I had chill time. I was covering Liz Hurley's wedding.
Okay.
But I also had some chill time. And I went to see this, she was called the Hugging Saint. And she basically hugs people, and she gets 100,000 people go and see her in a stadium, and she hugs them. It's, she'll do 4-day hugging sessions. It's quite crazy. Anyway, so I like the sound of that. Yeah, it's really cool. She goes all over the world. She's amazing. And so she's called Amma. Look her up. So anyway, so I went to do a story on Amma, and then as I was there and I was, just taught, she said, have you got any questions for me? And I said, should I go to Beijing? And she said, right, she wrote it down, go to Beijing. And she said, help the Tibetans. And I was like, okay, I'll go. So it was a bit of a crazy reason why I went.
Profile Me is a super shareable mobile application designed to help professionals grow their personal brand. Proudly paperless, this powerful tool packs the power of web, social media, and messaging into one beautifully designed interface that offers a unique and human-centric way to connect and build trust with clients. Easy to share on any platform and easy to save to any phone's home screen. With Profile Me, getting referred has never been easier.
And we did manage to do lots of reporting on what was happening in Tibet. And there were protests at the time when I moved there. And, I really worked a lot. I covered the economy. I covered everything. I was there for the Olympic Games. And of course, that seismic event changed China massively. But I made it. I really wanted to focus on human rights and some of the, awful things that were happening to people. Like people, there was, when I was there's a milk scandal. And so they had been putting melamine in milk, which basically means putting melamine in baby's milk. And you could water down the content of the milk with melamine, which is like a poison, but it would show up like a protein. And so it meant that people were drinking melamine. Now for babies, this can kill them or cause very long-term like liver defects. And it was only released to the world because of there was a joint venture between a New Zealand milk company and a Chinese milk company. And the New Zealand milk company, went to their government and said, what do we do about this? And then it was released that way. Wow. And so, but they had to wait. They sat on this for 6 months and it was only dealt with after the Olympics. So literally we had the Olympics, the ceremony finished and then the story came out. But people who talked to us, so there was like a father who built a little, campaign group, and he would talk to the journalists about it. He was sent to prison for talking to us, or or like the lawyers of people who would defend people who'd lost their houses. They would be, the lawyers were sent to prison. And so, when you talk about human rights, it's very much about, just people trying to live ordinary lives who are not able to do the smallest of functions in their life. And I did that job for 5 years. I was involved with, huge, so many stories. It was just like, you're just deluged with stories on a daily basis. And, China growing in superpower, becoming onto the world stage, but also, covering stories from North Korea. I reported from North Korea. We set up the first bureau in North Korea. So, going
how
there.
Is that? I mean, it's just a place you just don't know in the general public much about. And obviously you've seen behind that kind of wall. What was it like to be there?
Well, I can't claim credit for it really, because I had a colleague called Raf who was obsessed with North Korea. And he basically would go out to dinner. It sounds crazy, but it's true. He would basically go out to dinner with North Korean officials in different locations. He learned Korean and he, over time, built up trust with them. So would get to go into North Korea, right, and then gradually open the door for the rest of us to go. And so, you had a minder, you would go on very much like a tour. So you'd see only the official kind of view of things. And so you'd see like these shiny monolithic buildings, but actually there was nothing inside them. They were not heated. So it was like freezing. In the winter, it was like minus 40. And, you know, like you're in a restaurant and everyone's getting drunk from 7 a.m. because it's so cold. That's the only way you survive. And so everyone's just drinking soju. And then you go to the toilet or something. And then it's literally a skating rink of ice on the floor. Because if the toilet's not working, it's just because everything is so cold, you know, they'll heat one room, but not the rest of it. So it was very crazy. And you always had a minder. And I remember a colleague of mine saying, like, so the way that we set it up was we had two journalists, well, they were journalists, who I'm using whatever you call them, air quotes. Yeah. So we had two journalists who would they were North Koreans and they would work on stories. So they would go and film. So if it was like so we had to get permission to do certain events. So if it was like the mass games, we could, we'd set up permission to film the mass games, which was like this incredible spectacle of 10,000 people marching, all the school children in the country bussed in and waving flags in unison. And they'd have practiced their routines and their drills for months on end. So it was, and then of course, the dear leader would be waving. So it was fascinating. And then obviously there were moments when we'd be in the country and North Korea would have let off some kind of nuke or done something. And then we'd try and get response from whoever we could, or just literally just have shots of people walking across the street or something, because you couldn't talk to anyone. But it was really fascinating to be there. Yeah,
I could definitely tell there's a few episodes in this for sure. So you will be coming back. I'm kind of intrigued at kind of what brought you home, and actually, given all those experiences and all your travels and all your adventures and the causes that you've championed, that Tetbury must be quite a quiet place right now for a traveling soul such as yours.
Yeah, I think I got to a point where 5 years in Beijing, I was really burned out because I was running the bureau. So I was basically in charge of a team of people in North Korea, in China, in South Korea, Hong Kong. And it was exhausting. It was draining. It was exhausting. And, it was relentless news coverage. It was a time when we went through, global economic recession. Everyone was looking to China to, be this powerhouse to pull us out. And it did. And so there was non-stop news. And so I never really had a day off, and never really, unless I left the country.
Yeah.
And there was a point where, so when we did really sensitive human rights stories, I remember there was a lawyer that Obama had talked about. So when Obama came to China, what used to happen, this is in the days when China had a bit more respect for America. In those days, if a US president was going to China, they would release a high-profile Chinese dissident that they'd been holding, and they would release them. And it was kind of like seen as, oh, we're doing this thing for America, and it was giving America face, basically. Like there's a big concept of face in China, and so there was this particular human rights lawyer who he'd been detained in a black jail, which is like a hidden prison. So you have the normal prison system, which is regulated, and then they will disappear people where they're just like held by thugs in underground spaces, and there's no rule of law, there's no nothing for them, and they're literally kept in like a pigsty or something. I've been to a couple of black jails, and they're just or a basement or something, and they're just held. And anyway, so this guy was managed to escape, and he contacted my colleague. So somebody who worked for me, he contacted her. It was like most bizarre, but he did. And anyway, so we went to interview him. And on the back of that interview, the Chinese government and then he managed to escape. And there was these kind of religious organizations within China, so American secretive religious organizations who act as people trains, and they get people out of the country and then get them to refuge in America. And so that's what happened. And the Chinese government was furious with us. And so when that happens, they retaliate in various ways. And they go after people, for like, they might go after your taxes or go after your partner if you were married to a Chinese person. But for me, I was single or whatever. And so they started doing, I realized they were hacking. I knew they hacked, but they really were hacking and forwarding emails, like just playing all kinds of mind games to various people, like an ex-boyfriend of mine. They were like, I was emails that I'd sent to other people, they were forwarding to him. And I was like, what? And I got to a point where, and I was being followed, and there was lots of stuff that I just felt like this is getting a bit too hot to handle. And actually, so I phoned my boss and I said, I think I need to get out of China for a couple of weeks. So I left and I flew to Bangkok, and literally the next day there'd been protests in Bangkok, and literally the next day, and our office was right by Lumpini Park in the middle of Bangkok, which is where the protests were. So our office looked out onto the protests. And literally the next day, the protests turned violent in Bangkok, and there was literally civil war in Bangkok. And I remember being in my flak jacket thinking, I've been hacked, and I felt really like in a mentally dangerous position in China. And I've come to like what used to be my home, and there's like civil war around the office. They're firing bullets in the window of the office, and we're wearing flak jackets to go to 7-Eleven. And it was like, and at that point I was just like, this is just nuts. And so it was definitely I got to a point where I was burned out. I didn't have that same capacity to do it in the same way anymore. And I wanted to have kids. I wanted a proper relationship. Like I was, the relationships I had with people were kind of caraman, and we'd go to Afghanistan for like 6 weeks, and so you wouldn't see them, or they'd be in Afghanistan and I'd go, and so it was just not a place, it wasn't conducive for like proper relationships. And so I got to a point where I was like, okay, I need a bit more of a sensible life. And I moved back to London. You're really getting the long story. Moved back. And then I was like, I had about a year of being in London. And then the person I moved back for broke my heart. So I was offered a job to set up a TV station in Iraq. So I said yes. So off I went again.
Not one for a quiet life, I think it's safe to say, right?
Yeah. So went to Iraq, set up this TV station with Syrian and Kurdish refugees, which was fascinating, and I loved it. And then I had a health scare, and somebody said, and I was working for Al Jazeera in Doha at this point. And I had a health scare, and a gynecologist said, look, if you don't come back to London and settle down, you are not going to have children. And that was a moment for me. And I remember I was wandering around the Whittington Hospital in tears, because I was like, what am I going to do? Because I'd got this great job for Al Jazeera, and I was loving it, and it was great. I had a great life. And and I felt unemployable. I didn't know what on earth I was going to do. And so my son was born, and I had major health issues, which I skipped a bit. So I was also, the final assignment I did was I was working in Ukraine. So I was still working for Al Jazeera. I was in Ukraine.
Wow.
And it was the conflict in Ukraine. So I was just, Al Jazeera works differently. So they send you in for things. And so I was there for kind of 3 weeks or so. And the Russian rebels were pretty dodgy. And they were quite touchy-feely. And I was like, I don't like this. And I was taking my folic acid and, and it was a moment for me to be like, right, that's my last assignment. I'm not doing this anymore. And when my son was born, I had major incontinence. So I literally stood up and peed my pants. And I couldn't control my bladder. It was pretty awful. And I couldn't walk down the street without peeing myself. I couldn't. And I had sort of a good 18 months of having to go to the hospital twice a week, where I had, they did tibial nerve stimulation, where they stick electric current in your ankle, and in the hopes of stimulating your pelvis. Wow. So we tried that, physio. Anyway, I had surgery and that helped a lot. But in the course of that whole period, obviously I had a young baby with me and everything. I just was like, I can't go back to work. I can't be in an office and pee myself. It's just not cool. And whereas at home, you can manage it. And so then I was like, well, what am I going to do? And so a friend of mine got me to do some filming for her it was actually of Man United, of kind of like corporate stuff for Man United and some other like various big CEOs. And from that, I realized there were so many high profile CEOs who really struggled with being confident on camera and struggled kind of sharing their stories, but they would just freeze when it came to being on camera. And I've always had a knack of making people feel really comfortable on camera and just having a chat with me. And so people always used to say I could get really good stories out of people because they'd open up and they'd cry and they'd whatever. And so I started doing that, and it turned into, I was going out on film shoots, but that didn't work with having a baby. And so I quit journalism, did that. And it built up and it was, fairly successful. But the more I was doing that, and I was working with clients in the US because it was easier, because it was evenings. So I could still be, pretty much full-time parent.
Yeah.
And so I built a course, literally my son was playing with trains at my feet. I'd sort of built it, or he was very present with me, and started selling that, used Facebook ads to sell that. And I started selling that, in like 2017, and it grew. And I was selling, thousands of courses every month. Selling, multiple courses, different courses. And I created this course in I think 2019, called Confident on Camera. Mm-hmm. And it exploded. And and of course, for the pandemic, it was the perfect thing.
Absolutely.
And it was $19. So it wasn't, a huge price point for people. And so I, was selling over $1 million worth of courses. But I was still able to be very much present and be very hands-on with my son. He's autistic. He's high functioning. I know they don't use that word anymore, but so he goes to a normal school and all those things now. But at the time, he needed a lot of attention and still does. And I'm able to be there for, equine therapy and therapy sessions in the hospital and all those things. And be, so I really don't, I work, but I don't. I did a post about it on LinkedIn. I work, 15 to 20 hours a week. This week, I've definitely done less than that because there's been school strikes. And so I don't work Fridays because I take my son to therapy, and so you're lucky I'm talking to you today.
I'm so lucky.
So that's you've had I don't think you've asked me one question. So 2 questions.
But you see, this is kind of, again, I love that synchronicity. The commonality, and we were talking about this when we hit record, is this: we both have this like shared passion of stories and the power that stories have. And the reason why I needed to ask one question is because you have the right stories to share at the right time. And I know each one of those stories would have impacted different people at different places at different times in their life. And that's what I love about this. And having no agenda and having no format, just having an open conversation, we get to hear about all of your stuff. And amazing how you brought that through back to today so quickly as well. So
there's a few more, but yeah.
I was going to say there's other rabbit holes we can certainly dive down. But you're quite right. Usually I need to kind of like pull the strings, but I could just sit back and relax. I've had coffee. It's been a really nice experience for me. But I definitely do want to get you back. I am fully conscious of time, so I do want to ask you the one question I ask everybody that comes on the show. But before I do ask that, can I just thank you for your clarity and candor and sharing what you've done? I know this will be, at the very least, a very enjoyable episode for people to watch or to listen to. But also, at the very most, it's going to be a very positive impact for a lot of people too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
But the question I need to ask you is, if I am now the MC of the O2 Arena in London, 20,000 people have paid their hard-earned money to come and hear you do your thing, whatever your thing is. You're sat back in the green room, sipping a Prosecco, and you hear me call your name, and your walk-on music booms in, that song that motivates you, that lifts you, that gets you at peak state. Lucy Griffiths, what would your walk-on music be and why?
Oh God, it's got to be, it makes me think of school days, Appetite for Destruction. And
absolutely.
And yeah, it makes me think of school days. My nickname, so I was Carney before I was Griffiths. Yeah. And so I was always either Genghis Carnage or that
is an amazing. That's the best nickname I've ever heard. I think that's so cool.
So yeah, it was. I as well as having, I was always the mix of. While I was really, passionate about human rights and all this, I also had a very nihilistic, crazy streak.
Yeah.
And the great thing about Asia is that you can be there are no rules and no limits. You can be as crazy as you like. And so there's a lot of fun times had. Yes.
But do you think that kind of, that characteristic kind of actually has been a massive plus for what you've had to do? Because it's kind of like, when I work in the frontline environment, is that kind of like that gallows humor kind of thing really helps you get through a lot of the time.
Oh yeah. You have to. I'm not going to say half the things that but yeah, you have to. You have to.
Well, I know you're going to be back, but for now, give it up, Lucy Griffiths. Big round of applause. Woo, 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 woo.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's been my absolute pleasure. So to everybody else, I really hope you've enjoyed the episode. I'm sure you have. I have. A big thank you again to Lucy for coming on. Please do reach out, connect, and all that kind of stuff. I know I'll be speaking to Lucy about her stuff too, because there's a lot of things that Lucy does that I don't do. Online course is one of them. So I really want to talk to Lucy about that. Stay tuned for next Monday. Hit like, subscribe, and I'm not a details guy. Whatever it takes to get you back here next week. We have another amazing case to bring you, all about biscuits. Boom.
Ooh.
Yeah, absolutely. So for now, from me to you, have a great week ahead. Take care. See you soon. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye. Bye.